Okay, AP Stat, here is your second video about example 3. In the first video, I showed you what formulas you're using from your formula chart. So I'm going to write those down for you again, and I'm going to write them in the order in which you need to use them. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why we are doing this. Okay, so if you need to write the LSRL, of course, that's going to be this equation right here. But in order to write the LSRL, you must have the slope and y-intercept. So if you'll notice this, we've got Burger King reports the average and standard deviation of fat and protein content in a hamburger is as follows. So obviously for this problem, we don't have a list of data we can plug into Statlet. Instead, we're given our mean and standard deviation for our two variables, and we're given the correlation coefficient. So we have to use a series of formulas to find the slope and the y-intercept, and then use those in our final LSRL. So I'm going to show you how to do this. This is very algebraic. You will need a calculator in order to multiply these bigger numbers here, or these weird decimal numbers. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is start with B because I have everything I need for this equation. So I've got my correlation, my standard deviation for y, and my standard deviation for x. So in my calculator, I am going to find that value. It is 0.9723. It gave me an obnoxious decimal, but I just cut it off and rounded. That's what I did. All right, so then that leads us to our next equation because I now have enough information in it to find my y-intercept. So I have to have the slope to find the y-intercept. That's why I start with that first formula. All right, so once I do this, I'm going to multiply 0.9723 times 17.2, and I get another obnoxious decimal. And then, of course, I'm going to solve for A. And for A, I end up with 6.7764. All right, so now I'm going to write my LSRL. I now have used the information I was given to find my slope and my y-intercept. So now in context, I'm going to write my predicted fat equals my y-intercept plus my slope times protein. So that's my answer to part A. And please note that the way I determined which one was my explanatory and response, I just looked at my notation. All right? Protein is x bar for the average and S sub x for the standard deviation. So that's how I know that protein is my explanatory variable. All right, so now I'm going to interpret my slope and y-intercept. So I'm just going to say for each increase of 1 gram of protein in a Burger King hamburger, I can expect the fat content to be increased by about 0.9723 grams on average. Because of course, it's not going to happen all the time. That's why I need to say on average. This is just what I expect to see in general. All right, so now I'm going to interpret the y-intercept. So for the y-intercept, remember what the y-intercept is. It's when x is 0. All right, so when x equals 0, in other words, when my amount of protein is 0. So I can expect a hamburger at Burger King that has no protein to have a fat content of 6.7764. You know what? Let's put about in here. Well, I'm out of control. Of about 6.7764 grams on average. Now, we need to talk about this because that doesn't really make sense, does it? And sometimes your y-intercept will be that way. Sometimes they'll go on to ask you another question like, does this make sense in the context of the problem? Well, is it practical to think that a hamburger at Burger King that has no protein would have this fat amount? Possibly. I mean, it's not totally out the window, but almost everything that has fat also has some protein in it. So I'm not saying that all the time, but sometimes they'll ask you a question, but it will always be in the context of something you would understand. Okay, you don't have to be a nutritionist or anything to answer this question. So just keep that in mind, that interpreting the y-intercept, sometimes it makes sense in context and sometimes it doesn't.